Funny enough, I work for technical support, and so when things go wrong, I always feel like, of course, this happens. But I was
Right.
with my Bluetooth, and there's not much I can do for my internet. We live outside of city limits, and so we've got
Yeah.
kind of limited internet options. So
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I was doing the same thing. I'm playing with my Bluetooth headphones and trying to figure out if it's connected somewhere it shouldn't be, but whatever. We got to figure it out. So, we can kind of just jump into it. Again, I'll repeat for anybody who was bouncing in and out of us dealing with that. Again, this is Candid Conversations. Josh Tutt for Texas is joining us tonight. I really appreciate Josh taking the time. The whole point of this series is really just, if you follow me, my page is mostly about progressive politics, mental health, sustainability, and I love talking politics. I've done a lot of lives on and off, kind of just in general rambling about it. But with the new features that TikTok's slowly added to really be able to do these kind of roundtable or kind of back and forth conversations, it's really exciting to see a bunch of politicians really getting onto TikTok. And I want to really get them as a part of those conversations, learn more about your ideas, your campaign promises, and things that you would do if you were in office. Because especially during an election year, but also just in general, we've all talked about it, we need better representatives. And there's a lot of passionate people, including yourself, trying to run. So just want to find out a little bit more about you. And if anybody in the comments has questions, feel free to drop them. But we'll kind of just bounce in and out and, find out a little bit more about what Josh is about. So again, Josh, thanks for taking the time. If you want to just jump in and tell us a little bit about your background, a little bit about you, and kind of what you're running for, I guess it's a good place to start too.
yeah, sure. Thought you were exactly right about the importance of politics and politicians getting on TikTok. The thing that actually pulled me on was realizing that if I remember the numbers right, over 80% of TikTok's audience, which is huge, is under 35 years old. And I don't remember the number, but majority of it is in America. So while I can't hyper focus very well on my district, that's a lot of young folks across the United States that can be reached this way, and they deserve to be heard and be seen. So
Yeah.
for there I am as a politician, not answering the actual question you asked. So to introduce myself a little bit, so my name is Josh Tutt. I'm running for Texas State Senate District 18. It's a big 18 county district in rural Central and South Texas. It's also got little pieces of some more urban counties like Houston. I've got a little bit of Houston itself and the Northwest Harris County, Fort Bend County, places like that. If anybody thinks you might be in my district, kind of between Houston and San Antonio, go and check my pinned videos because I've got a map there and a city list because it's too hard to explain in 30 words or less. Um,
Right.
and they kind of do that on purpose, but I can't. That's just where I live, so that's where I'm running out. I live in Burleson County with my husband and our dog, who is 12 years old, Blue Healer. She is spoiled rotten. We have a little vineyard that we take care of ourselves. It's more of an expensive gardening hobby than anything. It's definitely not super productive lately with the extreme heat and drought this summer, the big freeze, and all the rain last year.
Yeah.
It's been hard for growing grapes, and Texas isn't really great for grapes, anyways.
Yeah.
Running for office because of that big freeze last year. I decided that when I woke up cold in my bed, that this is enough. I've had enough. I'm tired of this. Someone's got to do something about it. So I quickly realized that I am somebody. I should do something about this. I
Yeah.
already knew from past elections that so many times our elected officials, mostly GOP Republicans, go uncontested. They don't even have primary opponents so often. They just get to have their seats back for free, uncontested, no challenge. That means that they don't have to really campaign hard. They don't have to meet people. They don't have to persuade anybody or be held accountable. When just like you yourself can go and vote for yourself, and ta-da, you won with one whole vote. The rest of the votes don't matter, and that's no way to have a democracy. We deserve better than that. So I thought that I could do a little bit better than nobody and run for office. So I gave it a shot. I've never done this kind of thing before, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. So I'm here. The election is in 33 days, and
Hey.
I'm excited to see what happens.
Nice. And kudos to you. Because again, that's, right now we have a lot of people who are frustrated, but the hardest part is for people to just take that dive. You think you need to be an expert or have some sort of political background, but nobody had that. when they started. And at the end of the day, it takes that one big leap. And so, when it comes to your campaign ideas in general, what are some of maybe give us 3 or 4 key points that you say are your biggest passion points right now if you were to get in office?
I built my campaign off of 3 priorities that I got from talking to folks in the district. The first one is rural infrastructure. That includes things like rural internet access, fixing our dams, improving our roads, but also lately fixing our grid. And that's not just for the next winter storm, and that might be many years down the road. But our population is growing rapidly. We need infrastructure, whether that's energy or water infrastructure. We need that investment to be ready for our future. We need to better fund our public education system. So again, that's an investment in the future, right? We
Yeah.
need to have teachers who are well compensated. We're able to recruit and retain good educators and all the support staff that they need to give our students a future full of bright opportunities. And
Yeah.
maybe with some supplies thrown in, that'd be great. And then the third priority, excuse me, is expanding rural healthcare access in particular. I live in Burleson County. It's a small rural county, and I am adamant about the rural aspect of this because that's where I live. That's who I am. Texas has the highest rate of rural hospital closures, the objectively worst funded mental health care system, and the highest rate of uninsured citizens. Not just raw number, but the highest rate of uninsured citizens. And we can
Right.
fix all things by expanding Medicaid. We are one of only 10 states that hasn't done that, and it limits us.
Right.
It prevents us from bringing home all of our, well, not all, but a lot of our federal income tax dollars. So those are my top 3 priorities. You asked for 4, and if I had to pick a 4th one, I'd say advancing and protecting voting rights. I think it's one of the most important things that everything else hinges on.
Yeah, for sure. I want to talk about the school one in particular because, for those who don't know, I've run Earth Rebirth, that where the Mr. Earth Rebirth comes from, since 2011. So, Earth Rebirth focuses on food, energy, and water. We're a nonprofit, and the mission is to educate and empower people to take those resources into their own hands. And we've set up over 150 community gardens across Oklahoma, mostly, but in particular, coming from Oklahoma, we worked with a lot of schools. And even in OKC, there are literal billboards for Fort Worth recruiting teachers saying that the starting salary is closer to $50,000 because Oklahoma is notorious for really poor teacher pay. So on the surface level, somebody from Oklahoma, they might be a little confused. What is wrong with Texas schools in particular, when we at least see a kind of grass is always greener when it comes to the funding mechanism? Texas has always kind of been kind of our bigger sibling next door that's better funded. And we kind of always looked at them as if they can do stuff better than us in certain capacities, especially schooling. So what would you say are some of those biggest shortfalls in the schools in Texas right now?
Um, so while there are, you can do funny things with numbers. And so while there are definitely teachers, there are localities where teachers are paid well, or the average is high. The vast majority of teachers are making significantly less than the national average. You'd have to give me a minute to look up the exact numbers of what the average is for teachers in Texas.
Yeah.
We are facing an extreme teacher shortage. I think I saw it as high as like 60% of teachers are thinking about leaving the profession, particularly after the way that we handled COVID, doing remote lessons and doing hybrid, both remote and in person. Teachers were having to manage multiple classrooms at a time. And
Yeah.
then lack of workplace protections or respect as workers, because teachers are workers too, really has created an environment that's pretty hostile. And that's before we even get into book bannings, where Texas has the highest rate or the highest number of book bannings that's occurred. And that's mostly happening at like the school board level. And then we've got, of course, all the politicized scare about CRT, which when I talk to teachers here in Texas, that's not something that we teach elementary or high school students.
Right.
College. And so we need to we aren't giving the autonomy and the trust to our teachers to be the professionals that they are and to educate kids. So this is all leading to on the brink of a crisis, I'd say, of a teacher shortage, and as well as for the teachers who are still in our schools, we're drastically mistreating them. Is really
Right.
what it is. So,
Yeah.
and that doesn't mean to say that there aren't districts that are trying their best, that are doing well. Sometimes it's a district level, sometimes it's a state level, sometimes it's all of the above. It's complicated. I'm not going to pretend it's all like black and white, but those are some things that um, we can address a lot of issues with better funding.
Right.
And that's not just for teacher pay because that's a big talking point, but making sure that there's equitable funding, making sure that there's funding for supplies. I talked to one teacher who said that he had to pay for like granola bars and water bottles out to keep in his classroom out of his own pocket, so that way the next time that they were in a lockdown, he'd have some snacks for his kids. And
And
so just funding for stuff like that. Technology. I've talked to too many teachers who go in on their days off to use the copy room, crossing their fingers that it works that day, because they need the time to be able to do that and make copies. And so pay for support staff, the paraprofessionals who help keep things running. That really helps the teachers to do their job of being teachers and not like IT support, you know?
right. Yeah. And you mentioned safety. That would be definitely another big one. If I remember right, Texas is ranked almost number one or close to it in firearm deaths of children and in school shootings. And in a country with a giant problem with this issue, that's a huge statement. And so, even if it's a few $1,000s here and there for a teacher compared to the state next door, is it really worth that risk when you're just constantly looking over your shoulder and trying to protect these kids? I mean, it's just there's so many lose battles there, and just the anxiety of the job at this point is so hard. And then we demonize teachers on so many levels when it comes to what they're trying to accomplish on so little. So yeah, it's a frustrating thing. I also want to get back to the grid thing because in particular there. Oh, hold on. TikTok just had the passcode thing come back up. I'm trying to, I guess, verify I'm a real person or not in the middle of a live. But I've posted a lot of different sustainability videos, and anytime I talk about California, there's always a back and forth in the comments about California this, California that. They can't do this with their electric grid. And for some reason, Texas always kind of gets selectively left out of that conversation in comparison with the problems they've had in recent years, because it's been both extreme heat and cold that has caused issues in Texas. What are some of your reasons that you think that is a big issue of neglect in Texas, especially in a state known for its energy independence? And what do you think some of those solutions might be at this point?
Yeah, so I'm going to cite my source up front. I've learned a lot about the energy grid and like the politics behind it, because there's a lot of politics. Go figure. In Texas about our energy infrastructure from a podcast called The Disconnect, which is run by energy reporters and journalists such as Moj Bushell. And it's not NPR who hosts it. It's a station out of Austin, I believe. But it's a podcast you can find online, and it's amazing. And I've learned a lot that way from that and other sources, of course. So you're right about us suffering under strain during the summer, and there are a few different reasons for that. For one, there's a political motivation to do not allow further power outages. We can't have another major outage. That would look bad on the leadership. And so my understanding is a lot of our generation sites are going overtime, basically, that they're not being allowed or they're not able to take the downtime that they need for repairs, regular maintenance, routine things like that, because they have to power through the summer and have to prove that we can do a hot summer, which, for what it's worth, we mostly did. There were kind of localized outages, and it's hard to pin any one outage, especially if it's more regional, to the grid versus local transmission lines. Like a tree branch falls on the power lines in your neighborhood. That's not the governor's fault. Let's be real. But strain on our generation sites, that's something. Limitations from our transmission lines to get energy from where it's produced to where it needs to be delivered are major barriers. And what was I going to say next? And just because we were able to limp through extreme heat in the summer, and even make it through last winter, which last winter was really mild. We did not have anything close to Winter Storm Uri.
Yeah.
And it's kind of untested. The weatherization has occurred, but the thing is that occurred at the transmission site or at the generation sites, not for the natural gas transmission or delivery pipelines. So there's all kinds of components, and they all got to be working in sequence. There's, in fact, one place. The Disconnect podcast talks about a generation site, a power plant in Midlothian, Texas, that is pretty well robustly winterized, and it didn't go out during the power outage this so in 2021. And the reason why it stopped producing power, though, was because the natural gas lines going to the plant froze up and it was not receiving gas or not enough to function at full capacity. It's a big chain from fuel to light bulbs in my house, and there's a lot of links that haven't been fixed yet. And then the secret that nobody's talking about, the shadow looming behind all this, is our population is just rapidly growing. It just is. The pandemic, made it difficult for us to realize what our true energy consumption was, because it kind of changed life for a year and a half, 2 years, till today.
Right.
And so that meant that our behaviors changed. And so suddenly, when people started going back to work, et cetera, our demand has increased massively from this growing population, and it's going to continue growing. And so no matter what you think about extreme weather events, we need to be prepared for higher energy demand in the future, just permanently.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And my family, so again, to put a little background, all of my family is from West Texas. If you've seen the movie Friday Night Lights, which I'm sure you have, my mom went to Permian, my dad went to Midland Lee. And my grandfather, from 17 years old, worked in the oil and gas industry and still does to this day. My other grandfather was a postmaster in Midland for like 40 years. But that small town mentality, they always, as a kid, were very supportive of my ideas of sustainability. But there was also this idea that, well, we're either not there yet technologically, or we will always need oil and gas. And when it comes to this rapidly growing energy demand, and knowing that fossil fuels in particular, oil and gas, are getting more expensive to find, harder to find, and it's going to become more sparingly, obviously renewables are a part of the equation, especially in a state like Texas. Solar, wind have tremendous potential, already are being used in a lot of ways. But what you saw is both nationally and in the state is when these issues happened, there was some misinformation and a lot of finger pointing on which resource was most responsible. And so how do you combat that? Do you feel like that's a significant problem with the average voter you talk to in Texas when it comes, what is the kind of, sorry, it's kind of a multi-part question, but what is kind of the average understanding of where those alternatives play into the role when you talk to your voters?
There's kind of two questions there. There's how do I persuade people about what we do next, about solutions I'm proposing, et cetera. And then there was also questions like, how do I deal with misinformation?
Right.
And one, usually I'm talking to somebody and they want to argue about why it happened. I ask them if they think it's been fixed, if they think it should have happened in the first place, if we should have prevented that. Before this even comes up, usually I start the conversation to get to this point by just asking them, what was it like for you and your family to go through that? Because everyone's got a story from that day. Just the people who don't, people in Port Lavaca, who they'd had all of their energy infrastructure basically replaced after Hurricane Harvey several years back. So brand new infrastructure, and it worked well for them. They didn't have much outages at all there and in Rockport, or so I'm told. And then, I don't talk as much with folks in Far East Texas or up towards Amarillo or in El Paso. They're on separate grids from bordering states. They are not on the isolated Texas grid. So they didn't have those problems. But most people I talk to who weren't next door to a hospital and on their priority grid, locally speaking, everyone's got a story. So I usually start that way, and I kind of talk about that experience and that kind of start from that common ground and establish that understanding that this should not have happened, that this was not acceptable, this was a failure of leadership, no matter if you want to blame green energy or not. And then for the folks who do, one fun fact, by the way, Texas, if I'm remembering right, is the national leader in wind energy production. Most of that, vast majority of that being West Texas. I don't know the ratio of how much that is on the Texas's isolated grid versus off, because West Texas is kind of a unique energy grid situation as they're interconnected. But so there's that. Usually my rebuttal is, so we've got smart people who manage our grid for the most part, and they do like calculus and math to find out like how much energy production can we expect from solar energy today, and they use all that math, those estimates, to do this. So the implication that wind energy failed us, it's like, No, wind energy performed about as much as it was expected to those days. In fact,
Right.
it was a little bit better. It wasn't doing much compared to other days that are good for wind energy or good for solar, for example.
Yeah.
But we anticipated that. That was expected. We weren't expecting wind energy to save the day on those days. That was
Right.
when the natural gas was supposed to kick in, which is literally their suggestion is we should have more natural gas. Okay, what happened with the natural gas? It froze
Yeah.
up. It did not reach the generation sites. The Disconnect podcast talks about one example of, I think they may have been in Midland or nearabouts. They were talking about how out at the sites, like it had frozen up out there, and they couldn't do anything about it. It's like, how do you can't unthaw the pipeline all the way across the state. So for natural gas transmission to I think it was from actually the collection site to the processing plant where it had frozen up, something along those
Right.
lines. Again, lots of different links in that chain, and if it's blocked up at one spot, that's all it takes.
Right.
Um, so I would like to stress to folks how severe that was. My understanding from energy professionals who've spoken on this is that we were minutes away, like less than half an hour away from what is classified as catastrophic failure of our power grid, where several of our transmission sites would have been physically damaged because of the lack of energy, and it could have taken months to restore power. Um,
Right.
that's not very energy capital of the world of us behaviors. So I'd like to
Yeah.
prepare for the future. So
Yeah, and and again, when it comes to a state that talks about energy independence, why I love talking about renewables in general is people always ask, well, what do you think the most sustainable form of energy would be? It's simple to me. It's something that every single person can contribute to. If the grid collapses, I can't just go set up a natural gas well in my backyard. I can set up a solar panel. I can set up certain smaller renewable energy systems that can help me get by, or my community, my neighborhood, little areas that can help offset that pressure on a greater grid. But another issue is just the reliance on that giant company, which ends up dictating a price when things like this happens too. In Oklahoma, we had the similar issue where suddenly we wake up a couple months later and they're like, oh, guess what we're going to do? We're going to jack up the prices because we got to figure out how to pay for that. And you can't do anything about that. And as a politician, do you have any ideas on kind of, and also, how bad of an issue was that in Texas? Was there any price gouging in particular that you saw with certain citizens? And how do we prevent that in the future where we know these are going to be bigger issues when it comes to the pressure of the grid?
so I don't know if it counts as price gouging when the entire state was subjected to it. It wasn't
Yeah.
like localized, but basically, the really bad explanation is that ERCOT doesn't actually control any of the levers that deliver energy. What they control is the prices and the buying and selling of energy that's produced. It's kind of they're playing the monopoly money that eventually turns into real energy and real bills ending up at people's house, right? And so they don't have, as a regulatory agency, they don't have a lot of ability to control the production or transmission. But what they could do, one of the few like forms of power that they held was that they could raise the price. And so what they did was, in order to uh, compel as many people as possible to transmission or generation sites to produce power, and as many places to conserve power, they jacked up the price as high as they could, like up to the legal limit, which is something like, I don't know, $92,000 a gigawatt, I think it was. Don't quote me on that. I can't remember if that's the
Yeah.
exact number, but to the highest legal limit that they could, in order to survive that moment of tinkering on the edge there. Um, so, which resulted in across the state, many Texans are facing increased bills for energy bills, but specifically because of the debt that basically are. It's not that the state's in debt. It's, I believe it's like the energy suppliers are paying back on a payment plan for like the next 10 years, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, and that's being paid by homeowners and by
Right.
residents. And so I think that would have been a great instance for Texas to tap into our rainy day fund, a large surplus of cash that we keep around for a rainy day. And I guess that was a snowy day, but I think it qualifies. So that's one thing that I think that the state could do. I think that we could prevent things like this from happening by this is easier said than done, but by prioritizing residences rather than corporate or industrial places or office buildings that are often vacant. A lot of
Yeah.
Texans were frustrated because downtown areas were lit up all through the blackout as they still had power, whereas the houses out in the suburbs didn't. Um, so there's that. I would also love to support rooftop solar however I can. And then and that sounds good because it does mean that power companies aren't always as in control of your energy production. At my
Yep.
place, even if I could have just kept my well, because all our water comes from a well, if I could have kept our well pump going, we could have kept water flowing through the pipes. Like they teach you in Texas, just run water through the pipes. It won't freeze. You can't do that when all the power goes out. One solar
Right.
panel or a backup. We've got generators. You've got several of them now, but keeping that going would have kept us through the storm. Um,
Yeah.
and then what was I going next? Is that I'd love to do boring things like update our building codes. My understanding after talking with one advocacy group was that Texas is still on 2015 building codes, meaning that we've got quite some updating to do, resulting in energy savings, just in order of thousands of dollars for homeowners, and this is for new construction,
Mm.
as well as I would love to see if we could subsidize things like in-home insulation to help improve existing construction, aka people's current homes. So if something like this happens again, it won't be as severe, and then maybe just maybe it'll reduce our energy bills. In the heat of the summer when we're trying to keep that air conditioning from escaping, right? So
Right.
I think there's a lot of progress that we can make, and hopefully none of this has sounded horribly partisan. I haven't
No.
even talked about wanting to regulate the grid so we can get interconnected in the rest of the country, not just so we'd have redundancy in case something like this happens again, but so that way we could actually sell energy. When we're having a good wind day for wind energy in West Texas, we could sell that off to other states if only we
Yeah.
were interconnected and able to compete in the nationwide energy market. That's
Yeah.
that's not exactly how it works. I mean, it's not like you box up energy in Texas and ship it to New York, but
Right.
I hope that's that interconnectedness gives us both redundancy and access
Right.
to that kind of market, which I thought would be kind of essential for that title of energy capital of the world. So
Yeah.
I want to retain that by having a wide portfolio of energy resources. Everyone
Absolutely.
thinks that liberals and Democrats are going to, come in and kill gas and oil with a knife the day after the election. And that's while I see writing on the wall that says gas and oil isn't going to be the king on the mountain forever. A bunch of automobile producers are moving to entirely electric fleets for the future. I just think like, well, let's plan ahead and be prepared for that eventuality. That doesn't
Yeah.
mean I plan on shuttering gas and oil energy companies. Full stop. I do not.
Right.
I want to help create transition plans. I want to help bolster a diverse portfolio of energy resources.
Right. And there were so many good points in that. When you talk about renewables, so often the argument is, well, that can't replace oil and gas. That can't replace oil and gas. And it's very important to understand that there really isn't a resource that can collectively do what oil and gas was able to do for the last 250 years. That is a very time in human history that will very unlikely ever exist again in that certain form, especially with what we know at this point about global resources. But when it comes to renewables in particular, there's so many advantages there that can alleviate those problems that we're talking about. And it's not even just the ability for Texas to sell that excess to states. I've always loved one single quote from Van Jones, and it was actually from the documentary Fuel in like 2009. And he had said, with solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, some of these other renewables, every home can be a power plant and every person can be an energy entrepreneur. And what more sustainable form of energy could we possibly think of? I mean, it's not even the idea that everybody has to produce. Everybody should have the ability to, and the ability to exchange the excess. If I'm using less and I'm producing more, why is my neighbor not getting that energy? And back to your point on rooftop solar, Norman, while I was there, I spent 15 years in Norman, Oklahoma, and we became the first city to commit to 100% renewable energy by a certain date in the state. And it's a mix because we had a city commitment that's like 2050, and then there's the Sierra Club commitment that's like 2035. But we were the first city to make the commitment. And I was on the Environmental Control Advisory Board for 3 years, closer to 3 years, while we went back and forth with the utilities on what this campaign or this promise as a city would look like. And they were pretty adamant that they didn't want rooftop solar. They loved the idea of these renewables because they knew it was inevitably going to be a part of the solution. But what they like are solar farms, wind farms, and these areas where they are still a big play in the production. And so those things are going to exist. Like at the end of the day, when it comes to production, it's very important to understand economically, yeah, producing more in one area, like a giant, if you have 100 acres that's not being used for anything else, there's a lot of sun there. There's a lot of wind there. You can that energy can be produced all in one area, and it's cheaper to move, all that stuff. At the same time, one giant natural disaster can wipe out those giant solar farms, wind farms. We had one here in OKC that just had a drunk driver go into it twice and caused big issues for the utility company, and they finally had to build bigger walls by it. But all of these have to go in together. There's going to be always be giant corporate energy production, but what we don't have enough of is individual production being a part of that. As consumers, we have to have some role in actually determining what we're going to use and help driving down the price. Otherwise, when it comes to these disasters, we're just going to have to throw our hands up and be like, oh no, what are you going to charge me now? And with these sources, that's the biggest asset, is that you can do it. Anybody can do it. A seventh grader can Google how to make a solar panel and make them. And obviously battery technology and things have to improve, but there's no perfection source, and fossil fuels never were. So the idea that we have to pretend any of these others will be is just a fallacy. We need to focus on improving. We have to take all of these and find the best assets of each and make them work together. So
I would love to help subsidize, like I would love the government to see what they could do to help make that happen, to distribute that energy production. For
right.
one, because when homeowners or even businesses have the capacity to produce, even if it's just some energy, that mitigates what their energy bill might be.
Exactly.
Especially if the state can help with subsidizing the cost of that. And I know there often are incentives for that sort of thing already. So let's look at that and make sure that's actually working for homeowners. Because those kinds of subsidies and incentives are often the specific targets of attack. Because, well, we can't have green energy, so they're going to attack the subsidies that support it. But I also want to, you talked about, big corporatized solar farms, for example. And one common thing I see, especially in rural places, they don't want that because they think it's going to damage the land, or make it unusable. Or sometimes there are arguments about eyesores, as if oil derrick is somehow more sightly.
Or
That part never
burn.
made sense to me. But we do want to take environmental concerns into consideration, of course. Where I live, I think I think there's like 4 or 5 flaring sites within 20 minutes of my house.
Mhm.
I think there's even 2 or 3 that are within just 10 minutes of my house. But my point is that we've got these all over the place, and the current infrastructure that we've got has its own environmental concerns, has its aesthetic concerns, has its opportunities for improvement. Because what if we made these flaring sites, which literally what it is they're collecting, raw petroleum product, and the natural gas is just a byproduct. It's considered waste and extra. It's not what they're collecting at this time, and so they just burn it. So that way, the burning it is that way it's not raw methane going into the atmosphere. It's the burn off byproducts, but they're just burning it off as waste. They're not producing energy off of that burned fuel,
Yeah.
which elsewhere we are collecting and selling and profiting from. So what if we were able to promote energy production at these collection sites,
Yeah.
on-site production, because they're already connected to the grid, because they've got electrical, equipment that does need to be monitored and does need, electricity regularly. And so if we made it so that way these could feed back into the grid, these could, one, keep themselves going in the case of a freeze, perhaps, and two, could help produce just a little bit more across the state wherever we've got these sorts of production sites.
Yeah.
There's ways for that. All of our means of energy production could be improved for higher energy efficiency, energy conservation, good old Boy Scout kind of ideology, right?
Right.
And then to just make more reliability for our future.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've taken a handful of friends down to West Texas during the holidays, and explaining the flares are always a really funny process on their face. They're like, "I'm sorry, they're doing what? I thought we used what? Why? What?" And it's just it's candlelit canvas at night when you look across West Texas. Those flares are all over the place in Midland and Odessa, It's an ironic thing because you're right. Like that is an energy source that we're burning off, and it again they do it for certain reasons, so they're not releasing a pure worse byproduct, but there's still it's a literal energy source there that they could be using to cycle through. And there's just at certain that's one of the biggest things I think people not in the oil and gas industry don't realize is how bloated the industry is too. So there's a lot of inefficiencies to it. My grandfather, again, when he retired, he kind of switched gears where he wasn't as physically equipped to go out into the field. He kind of just started doing more consulting. But one of the things I was always more proud of is he started to realize just how much equipment was being thrown onto the dirt next to the rigs instead of actually being resold or recycled. And he would go out to a company and be like, hey, can I get this for $5,000? And he'd fix it up and sell it for 50 because the industry just doesn't care. They'll just buy a new one. And that inefficiency fits into a lot of different places, but there's a lot of room for optimization, especially when we're watching, again, we're talking about a finite resource there. It's only going to get harder to find. It's only going to get more expensive. It's the law of economics at this point. And it's really important that we offset that in some capacity, but also just use it as best as we can and sustainable as we can if we're going to use it at all. Personally, we shouldn't be using it. We have to find a way to transition off it. You can't do that overnight. But if we're going to do it, let's not waste and do these things that are just creating more problems. So
Just basically hit the nail on the head about the primary reason why I call myself a progressive is because I want progress. I want things to be a little bit better, next in 2 years than they are now, for example. And so another point I wanted to mention is, yes, the flaring sites, at least they have the benefit of not being just raw methane being released in the atmosphere. Unfortunately, I do have to let everybody know that we are also the leader nationally by a large margin of just what's called venting, not flaring, just venting, where you do, in fact, just release the raw methane into the atmosphere. We also do that. And that's just further opportunity for reducing pollutants, reducing waste, and improving reliability and capturing that energy resource. So,
right.
And again, I hope this isn't like some kind of liberal agenda. This is stuff I learned from Boy Scouts about being minded, and from Sunday school about being good stewards of the earth. I don't think these are radical positions.
No, they're not. Yeah, and again, you talk about the aesthetic of what kind of community you want to do. Not only are my friends pointing out those flares when you go to West Texas, but what's that smell? It's like, well, that's West Texas. They're producing nonstop out there. You get that, you're 30 miles away from Midland, Odessa. You get that little tinge in your nostrils. You're like, oh, I know what that is. And my grandparents haven't drinking the water in Midland for years. It's shipped in from Big Springs, like a lot of people do, and they buy those giant big tubs. They don't use it out of their sink, and so. But at the same time, they're arguing against renewables or kind of shrugging like it's not there. And it's like the caliber of acceptance that's kind of been where we are in these problems is something that I think it's something that's just hard to overcome. There's a lot of rhetoric that, again, is just this is the way it is. And there aren't a lot of options to make it a lot better. And it takes some patience. But once you really see that light bulb go off where people are like, oh, there are a lot of options here. And I don't necessarily have to have water from another community or smell that in my air all the time. Then you really see that optimism kick in.
I may be a little biased. So I'm a graduate of Texas A&M University, and so I may be a fan. Know a few Aggie engineers, but I think that Texas has enough skilled workers and professionals to be able to figure out how to solve problems like that. It's like you tell me that it can't be done, I don't believe you. That nobody's figured out yet, then well, let's be the first. Is kind of my thought. That seems like small imagination to me to think that it's unsolvable. And we've solved problems by attempting, by giving it a shot. Maybe you do things that are a little less efficient before you get to the better solutions, but you gotta try. And there are, of course, all over the nation, folks trying to improve energy solutions. So that's in the works. But I will use that as a way to talk about that. I did just recently get confirmation of my endorsement by the Gulf Coast area AFL-CIO, which is one of the biggest union groups here in Texas, especially in my region. And whether it's energy or our teacher or education workforce or nursing, et cetera, all of these, my top three priorities, we've got workers who are going to make it happen, whether they're manufacturing or constructing. or teaching or helping in working in hospitals or doctors' offices. All of
Yeah.
these workers, these are what make these critical um, structures that make our state function. And so supporting them is going to be critical to taking care of all of these big problems that our future is presented with.
Yeah, for sure. I want to back up a little bit to you talked about mental health early on, and especially, post COVID. I'd say, looking back on this period of time, there's going to be so many studies just on the mental health epidemic that was what we all went through during the pandemic. And there's so many layers to that. But at the same time, we see, again, funding for mental health services cut across the board, not just state by state, but nationally. It's less and less of a priority. So how do we address that? Again, if you were to get in office, it's not something you can necessarily broad stroke of a wand solve, but what are some necessarily local options that you see to help people, or even just general suggestions on a state level that you, for your constituents, that could help them if they're having those issues, battling with it, and don't have access to hospitals or mental health services?
So I think the easiest things that we can do for mental health, especially in rural areas, is supporting telehealth services. The ability for folks to call in or Zoom in, whichever, to speak with a professional.
Yeah.
That's got to give credit where it's due. Governor Abbott's executive orders during the pandemic did make telehealth services more accessible to folks in rural Texas, and we need to make those types of permissions, exceptions permanent, so that
Yeah.
way people can access this in the future. So that way healthcare workers can work all over the state wherever they're needed, whether it's virtual or in person, et cetera, and to help them to be able to meet our needs, right? And so telehealth has been super critical for that, people accessing that many times in many places for the first time. And I would also love to see us improve mental health resources available through Texas public schools. Texas, in our Constitution, has a mandate to have excellent public school system available for all citizens for free. It's written that way in the Constitution,
Yeah.
and it's got to, and I think that needs to include, good mental health services. So, a school counselor um, to be able to help students who might be grieving or struggling or this, that, and the other. Better pay for teachers, smaller classroom sizes. That way, teachers can maybe notice when a student is struggling in particular.
Yeah.
Not that teacher's job is to be a watchdog for, you know, kids with mental health issues or to be a mental health professional. We already put a lot on the shoulders of our teachers, but also they are oftentimes the one who will notice that a child is struggling at home and might be able to connect them to resources, whether that's at the school or in the community. But first, those resources have to exist, and the teacher has to have enough of a workload balance to be able to make that connection to begin with. So I think those are two
Yeah.
solutions that I think help people across the whole state. Um, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about, part of my background in that when I was a student at Texas A&M University, which wasn't that long ago, I graduated 2016, I was a volunteer with the Student Counseling Helpline there, which is A&M's crisis intervention hotline, peer-led and all that. So while I'm no professional, I do have 1,000 hours of crisis and suicide prevention hotline experience, both as a volunteer and trainer, a lot of active listening skills, a lot of education on related topics, and especially on community referrals, helping connect folks to resources that do exist. And so I think that that experience, that actually being trained on how to listen to somebody in that moment of need,
Yeah.
that's crucial experience that I think make that probably more of our lawmakers need. So.
Yeah, for sure. So, when it comes to your campaign right now, are there any stories right now that have resonated as something that kind of feels like the pinnacle average Texan, that's kind of the battle they're facing, or you feel like your constituents are facing, or stories that are really relatable you've had on the campaign? I love hearing kind of, especially first time politicians, that getting out there and having to meet your constituents is always a really unique experience. I'm curious if what's a memory or somebody that maybe you've held on to as a valuable experience.
Like I said, I always make sure to talk to people about the power outage, the blackouts. Everyone's got a
Yeah.
story. I talked with one person just yesterday, day before. it's been a long weekend already. About what their experience was like, and they talked about how like they were lucky that they had a propane heater, which shouldn't have that going in the house because that's a carbon monoxide risk. But they did. They had actually like all of their neighbors over, and they basically made a huge house party out of it. Which like that sounds fun and heartwarming, right? It was actually survival, and that's how
Yeah.
everybody like made it through the cold, you know. And whereas I also talked with somebody several weeks back, an elderly neighbor who the power went out and was going downstairs to try to get in touch with someone else for assistance to check on people and all that, and made it down the stairs safely. But when she made it to like her office to go and sit and see if she could make a phone call even, fell out of the seat because it was dark. She couldn't see. And with
Mhm.
our older neighbors, that was really difficult. I've talked to
Yeah.
neighbors who lost fish. They had tanks of tropical fish, for example, or a reptile or bird. They just can't make it through temperature shocks like that. And it's like everybody's got a story. Things that don't hit the news. Things that might not have been measured in the statistics. Property damage, things that they haven't quite fixed yet. And and the collection of these stories just weighs on me, and that's why I'm so glad I chose to run when I did. And then after I started running is when things start, you might say, really started to hit the fan if they hadn't already. Roe versus Wade was overturned about a year, more than a year after I'd started running.
Mhm.
I and Shortly after that happened, I'd been talking with a Democrats group in Navasota, Texas. I went across the street after an independent bookstore to go check it out. And I saw the bookstore was the kind of friendly place, little pride stickers kind of subtly stuck in places, right? I know how to look for the signs. I've lived in rural Texas for a hot minute. And when I kind of introduced myself, she basically immediately started crying because she had just heard the news and it weighed on her, and like she was scared and she had nobody to talk to. She thought she was just alone in the whole county. And I don't know how much solace it was knowing that no, you're not alone. We were literally just across the street. I'm sorry we missed you. But, let me know if you need anything. But that's a story that sticks with me. We
Yeah.
are not alone out here or anywhere as we ever think that we are. And if my campaign succeeds at nothing else than giving a rallying point for local Democrats to realize that there are a few of us out here, that's a win in my book.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, and I think what we're seeing is, again, with the younger generation in particular getting more politically involved, is we've seen Georgia flip blue. We see Texas getting closer and closer over the last couple of elections. And at the end of the day, the majority of people, I genuinely believe, they want the things we're talking about. They want energy sustainability. They want resource. They want clean water. They want clean food. They want health care. They want to be able to have good schools that their kids don't have to worry about getting shot. They want people to be able to just take care of themselves. We just have a lot of people who have been politically exhausted by our representatives and don't know how to see through the weeds of who's doing what they're saying and who's just saying it to pander to you. And so you hear it all the time. Well, neither side's trustworthy. All politicians are hard. You can't trust any of them. It's like, and I get that. But at the end of the day, our biggest job now as voters is to really just do the diligence and listen and see what people are actually doing to try and defend what you need. At the actions speak louder than words. And, if you pay attention to the votes, that they're saying what they're doing, or they're doing what they want. And so, yes, both parties have a lot that we have to work on. But as you said, that's the point of progressive. It's when I identify as a progressive, it's not that I identify as a Democrat. Again, I was raised by a staunchly conservative Texan family. I was raised very religious, and I grew up and pretty much skipped right over the Democratic Party, very left. And I don't use the phrase leftist. I use the phrase progressive because I would never say that I'm the leftist. I'm always trying to figure out how to be better. And that's what progressive is supposed to be about. And I really don't see how anybody would not want to be that if you're trying to identify yourself from an ideology of politics. Our job is to try and be more informed and be more empathetic to everybody, not just our own needs. And that can be really hard in a society designed to make you very individualistic.
Yeah, if you ask some of the folks around here, being a progressive means that I'm a socialist, Marxist, communist, terrorist,
Yeah.
Democrat, liberal, whatever. Like it's just the whole list. All of those words identical, synonymous.
Yep.
And so I know that I won't be able to reach everybody, and I usually try to introduce myself as one of the neighbors before I get into all of that. I would rather them hear me talk about, that I think their kids should have a great school before they hear that dirty D word. And so I try to lead from that. But I wanted to address a couple things you mentioned about how, we've got to look and see what our legislators are doing, and all that. And often we don't get to have that. Like, we don't see what's happening unless there's actually somebody who runs against them. Because when
Yeah.
somebody goes uncontested, there's really nobody calling them out. So many
Yeah.
times they can slide under the radar so much easier, And then even if you do know, oh, I can't stand them, or I think this legislator's really let us down, you don't get to do anything about it unless somebody runs for office against them. You can't
Yeah.
vote against. You don't actually get to vote against any politicians. You only get to vote for somebody else. And if no
Yes.
one else runs, there are no options to reprimand or to speak your mind, to give you real feedback.
Right.
I've had folks who, of course, and nobody disagrees with me on that. When people like get mad or confused or whatever that I'm a Democrat, I'm like, well, I'm glad. They tell me they're going to vote for my opponent, who's been a legislator for 20 years. So yay, status quo. But I'm like, well, I'm happy to have actually given you that choice for once, because when it's just her on the ballot, you didn't really get to choose. She didn't need
Yeah.
your vote. Now she does. So
And at
if
least,
I get any closing statement, I want to encourage folks to consider running for office, especially if you're in a place like I am where your elected officials go unopposed. And that could be at the county level, at your school board, at the city council, or the legislature. So, like you said way at the beginning, you don't need a huge political resume or a lot of experience or to be an expert. Have you seen the people in office now? Like, don't be the one to hold yourself back, is what
yeah.
I'm saying. And there's people, me and a bunch of organizations that will offer help along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. So that being said, how do people support you in general for your campaign right now? Website, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so my website is tuttfortexas.com, spelled just like my username. It's the same username on all socials, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc. Especially TikTok's my biggest platform so far. Um, the biggest ways to help is I do have a volunteer page where folks can sign up, but honestly, the best way, if you know anybody in Texas, get in touch with them. Make sure that they're registered to vote. There are 9 days left to register to vote. The deadline is on October 11th. Make sure that they actually go and vote. Maybe they need info finding out who their candidates are.
Mhm.
If you go to the top link in my link tree in my bio, there is a program called 2 Million Texans. They're a group that's using the Reach app to do relational organizing. What that means is the app will help you take a look at your contacts in your phone, and it'll just straight up tell you if they've already voted or not. So when early voting starts in Texas, you can be like, hey, John, I see that you haven't gone to vote yet. Do you need a ride? Can I help you? Or do you know
Awesome.
who you're going to vote for? And you don't have to be like overt about it. You could just be kind of subtle, be like, so what are you thinking about governor race, right? And then like see what they say. And it's helpful. Even if everyone you know is a Republican, you could go in there and mark them as Republicans so candidates like me don't waste our time trying to call them.
Right.
It's just like that. Their goal is to reach 2 million Texans before the election is over, to bring new people in. Because you can't just, don't tell me, just go vote blue. That's not enough. We have to get more people. Like each of us has to bring 3 or 5 or 10 people to the poll who haven't voted before,
Right.
and because that's how we're going to do it, right? And honestly, what that's going to mean is more Texans are being represented. It's not about getting more Democrats out to vote. It is, but it's about getting more Texans out to vote. I sincerely
Yeah.
believe that when more of our population turns out to vote, we're going to see progress happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, one of the big things when you look country to country, one of the more disappointing things is definitely our voter participation. And one of the easiest ways to control people is to just kill their confidence that they have a voice. And at the end of the day, it's cliche to say, but I've always loved the saying, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. That goes for running for office. That goes for voting too. If you don't vote, you're absolutely not going to make a difference. You might vote. It might not get you what you want, but every vote absolutely plays more of a role than not voting ever will. It's really important that people remember that.
I think that the best thing that we can do to quash any fear of voter fraud, which is kind of questionable at best, whether that's a statistically significant threat. Yes, of
Hmm.
course, voter fraud happen. Is it significant? Does it actually alter our elections results? No, I don't think there's evidence of that. But the best thing that we could do to quash that is increase voter turnout, just like
Yep.
diluting a poison, right? Or something like that, a toxin. Like in most of the foods we eat, like arsenic in your apple isn't a threat because it's like just so few parts per million, right?
Yeah.
That's how chemistry works, and elections are the same way in that you increase turnout, the any incidents of voter fraud are going to be so diluted by legitimate votes by American citizens that
Yeah.
we're going to not have a concern about that. We eliminate the risk of fraud impacting the results of the election and making sure that our voices are heard, and it will be more of our voices.
Yeah.
So that way there aren't a huge chunk of us who never spoke up to begin with. I want to
Right.
do that by making like true online voter registration a thing. I think Texas could see same day registration. Um, Automatic voter registration is probably too radical at this time, but I think same day registration could be achievable. I
Yeah.
want to support young folks and voters on campuses, like university campuses,
Yep.
have better access to polling locations. Texas A&M University, while not my district, is just down the road, and they actually lost their early voting location that was on campus this year. They will only have a voting location on campus for election day itself, and I'm sure the
Wow.
entire population doesn't want to go to the same place on election day itself. It's a
Yeah.
Tuesday. They have classes. So
And there's
groups are
one.
working to fix that, but the legislature could do things to make voting so much easier here.
Yeah. There's only one for the entire college.
That was previously the case too. There was one for the
Right.
college for early voting, but which early voting in Texas is like a whole 2 week period or
Right.
10 days, which meant that people would have a bunch of options to go on. Maybe on a Friday works better or a Thursday. But
Yeah.
now it will just be one location on election day itself, not for the
Oh.
whole early voting position. The early voting location got moved from campus to City Hall, which arguably is vaguely nearby, but this is a college population where a lot of people are on foot. They don't
Yeah.
have a vehicle. They might not have a bicycle even. And the bus system doesn't actually stop directly at City Hall, believe it or not. It gets close, but not quite there. And there's just a bunch of missing pieces. And that's what voter suppression is, right? It's not telling you can't vote. It's telling you that, like, well, you have to get there between 8 to 5,
Yeah.
or you have to have this, this, and this in order to vote, or you have to have registered 30 days in advance. You
Yeah.
can't just
Exactly.
show up on the same day. You have to, or you can't do it here. You have to go across town and go vote over there. I worked for the election on election day in 2020, and I had to turn somebody away because they were at the wrong precinct, the wrong polling place for their precinct. This person had gotten there before 8 a.m. They probably left home early to go vote before work. And I have no idea this individual got to vote that day because they had to go to work. They had gone out of their way. They'd gotten to the polling place early. It was just the wrong one. And yes, we can
Yeah.
blame that person, and they should have been more educated. But what if instead we just made it easier for our neighbors' voices to be registered?
Yep.
Is that
100%.
radical?
Yeah.
Oh,
Absolutely. And again, from the ID laws in Georgia, this has been an issue all over the board. And it's right. It's like at the end of the day, just let people have their voice. It's a fundamental right in this country. So I really appreciate you taking the time, Josh. Is there anything you kind of want to do to wrap this up? I think we're right there near the, not sure where the hour mark was for us with our technical difficulties, but I think we're pretty close. I
yeah.
appreciate you patient in the beginning.
My biggest action items are always to consider running for office, or consider maybe a friend who'd be well suited for it. They might need encouragement. Maybe the idea just hasn't occurred to them. Of course, if you know any Texans, help make sure that they're registered to vote, because we have 9 days left. And then do what you can to get new people to the polls, because there is a lot of people who are in fact registered who just don't show up, especially for midterm elections. But
Yeah.
this election is super critical, not just for my race, but for races all the way up the ballot to the statewide level, and then down the ballot to local county elections. So that's my last advice: is when you do make it to go vote, vote the entire ballot. Do your research first. Maybe just ask a trusted friend for advice if you don't understand where the railroad commissioner is, or ask me. I'll tell you. But yeah, so those are my action items, and those are my last pleas for help.
Awesome. Well, I'll make sure that for everybody who's following, if you only caught part of this conversation, it will be up on Mr. Earth Rebirth YouTube. So for any voters in Texas, make sure you share it with them. Give them a last chance to hear some of Josh's awesome talking points. Again, I love your passion about it too, and just encouraging other people. Because like you said, sometimes that's the hardest part. It's just diving in. But the more voices that are heard, the more people put in their hat in the ring, then the more caliber of representatives we're going to have, the more educated we're all going to be.
I've described myself on stage before as the raccoon that crawled in the dog door. I wasn't expected to be here or necessarily asked to, but like that's their problem now. Like I'm here to cause problems for the people comfortable in power, and we need more
Yep.
people who are audacious enough or stubborn enough, petty enough. Insert adjective here, right? To shake things up, right? So
Yeah.
and to join me. So you won't have to
Yeah.
do it alone.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and again, I appreciate you taking this time. We'll be doing more of these conversations. I'll be doing some more bigger roundtables. If you have any other Texas representatives that you think would be good voices for people to hear in these conversations, both in the comments and Josh, steer them my way. And if you're in the comments, make sure you follow Josh, share his content so we can get it out there for the campaign, and then follow me for more of these conversations too. But again, Josh, I appreciate you taking time on your Sunday, and then we'll talk soon, sure.
Yeah. So thank you so much.
Yep. Have a good night. Everybody dream big, act bigger.